What I thought I would do today is just give you exactly what the title of this talk is, which is A Story of Sudanese Cinema. So I'm very careful to say a story because it is one among very many. And because I'm taking a kind of holistic view of the history of Sudanese cinema, I obviously cannot cover it all. Not all the films, not all the filmmakers, not all the incidents, not all the histories of Sudanese cinema. This is still ongoing research, so there's still a lot that is missing and a lot that's left to look at. It covers about 127 years of filmmaking, which is from when the first film was made in Sudan in 1898. It is selective and it is subjective. And also a huge caveat is that it is in the English language, relying mostly on English language sources. So that already discounts a huge literature that can be read in Arabic. My Arabic is not that great, so I'm not even going to veer into that territory just yet. So because most of us would be familiar with the newer Sudanese films, I thought it would be more interesting to go into my primary research, into the archive, into the beginnings of filmmaking in Sudan, which is the colonial origins. And there's a lot of interesting things that happen there, I think, that not only do we need to know about, but we need to address in the contemporary times. And then just a small update to what Suha said earlier about Khartoum being on screen. With Goodbye Julia, we have a new film that's just come out, a documentary film called Khartoum. And it is a collection of shorter pieces into a documentary feature, and it is currently screening it's having its world premiere in Sundance. So that's just an update. So there's a lot more of Khartoum on screen, not realizing, I think the filmmakers at the time didn't realize how important their footage will be, because it is now probably some of the last artistic interventions into Sudanese cinema. So just to start with the difficulties of studying the history of cinema or filmmaking in Sudan is that there is not a lot of academic sources, especially in the English language. There is very few. Even in Arabic, there is also not that many, even though there is more, and some is written by the filmmakers themselves, some of the classic filmmakers from the 60s and 70s. But these books or journals or however they had written, largely out of print, and some of them are very difficult to access as well. There is no archive of Sudanese films, so we do not know definitively how many Sudanese films exist. There is still an ongoing debate about how many feature films there are in this history of Sudanese filmmaking. And it depends on how you count, and it depends on whether you count foreign directors making Sudanese films, Sudanese directors making films outside of Sudan. So really, the list is still in debate. So a lot of primary research is necessary for the for the study of history of Sudanese filmmaking. The more recent successes of Sudanese films have engendered journalistic accounts of the history of Sudanese filmmaking, which is great because it gets the story out there. The story is much wider and much more accessible to a general public who isn't necessarily going to read academic articles about Sudanese filmmaking. But at the same time, the journalistic accounts recirculate mistakes sometimes, and I've seen that a lot. So what I thought I would do now is share my screen with you for some images and to tell you how the Sudanese filmmakers themselves are telling audiences about the history of Sudanese filmmaking. And I find this a really beautiful moment in the history of Sudanese filmmaking, where the filmmakers are delving into the archive themselves. And it's a really appropriate way of showing visualizing Sudanese film history through film. So here is a moment from Yolda at 20, where the older Suleiman is teaching the younger Muzammil about the history of Sudan, history of film, kind of just mentoring him in this visual history. So at some point they watch a Jadallah Jubara documentary. So those who are unfamiliar with Sudanese film history, including and especially Sudanese people, they can get it through a nice visual medium here. Just trying to see how I go next. Okay. And then, of course, Suhaib Ghasem al-Bari's work, what he has done for the history of Sudanese filmmaking is far more interesting, accessible, and widely reached than you could read it about in any book. So he's really kept the history of Sudanese filmmaking alive through its filmmakers. And so he has two films of which you most likely will be familiar with if you're interested in Sudanese film, which is talking about trees, and Sudan's Forgotten Films, which is a shorter Al Jazeera documentary. Frederick Cifuentes made a kind of bio documentary about Jadallah Jubara, which is also really fascinating. A lot you can learn there from the filmmaker himself. And then a lot of documentaries that you can find online. Obviously, there are all kinds of documentaries, but I believe the Al Jazeera documentaries would be they would have been more thoroughly researched. And what we see now is a push towards the archive, which is extremely necessary, especially in today's conflict Sudan. But even before that, the history of neglect of Sudanese films, as we've seen with Ghasem al-Bari's documentaries, the question of the archive is even more urgent now. And here are just some of the archive attempts. So the Colonial Film Archive, that is a whole problematic collection of the history of Sudanese filmmaking. It actually has the largest collection of Sudanese films from the colonial era. And there's a great thesis now, MA thesis, I believe, by Daniel Malik, who really takes the Colonial Film Archive to task, asking for the decolonization of this archive, which a lot of Sudanese people cannot access, or it's just not necessarily accessible. There are some films that can be accessed online, but not all. The Arsenal in Germany is doing a lot of work now with the families of Sudanese filmmakers, restoring, digitizing, and promoting Sudan's film history. There's a lot of very interesting work happening there. Also, Erica Kata, Eman Sharif, Talal Afifi are doing a lot with the archive of Hussein Sharif. So these are still archives in the making, and there's a lot to come out in the next few years. So I think there's going to be a lot of interest in Sudanese cinema, and a lot of interesting aspects coming out of Sudanese cinema as well. Other things like Sudan Memory, which is a great open archive for Sudanese culture in general. It does have some collections about Sudanese history, especially Frederick Cifuentes' images. The Internet Archive, and so on. This can be extended somewhat to temporary film screenings, even though it doesn't constitute an archive. What's happened recently with the interest in Sudanese filmmaking is that programmers are programming Sudanese films all over the world in film festivals. Sudanese filmmakers, or those interested in Sudanese film history, are also curating. Importantly, they're curating contemporary and classic films side by side. So I think this really gives us, for the first time in the last few years, like there's a lot of films that I had never seen. I grew up in Sudan. I went to the cinema in Sudan, but I had never seen these classic films in Sudan. For me, Tajuj was the only film that was ever made in Sudan or about Sudan, because that's the only thing that I ever saw, and it was the only film I ever saw on television. It was the only film that was promoted. So now, the older I get, the more I'm looking at the history of Sudanese filmmaking through these kind of programming. So more of this, please, whoever's curating Sudanese films. So here we get to see classic and contemporary side by side, which gives us a kind of, it allows us to have a more holistic overview. We can make connecting thematical threads between Sudanese films and so on. So I think there's a lot of interesting work that will come out of Sudanese film history. Here's just more examples. Shasha Movies did a whole program on classic and contemporary cinema. This is Safar Film Festival last year, also contemporary and classic cinema. This was curated by Talal Afifi. So I don't think I have a lot of time today, but this is, in general, this is a paper I'm writing at the moment, which kind of divides Sudan's film history into four very rough eras, which is the colonial, the post-colonial, the curtailed. I'm still working on definitions for this, and the contemporary. These years there's a lot of overlap, but this is generally just kind of a bracket to give us an idea about which kind of films I'm looking at and in which kind of period. The first film made in and about Sudan, not necessarily from the Sudanese perspective, is Alarming Queen's Guards Grenadiers at the Battle of Omdurman. This was 1898. The fascinating thing about filmmaking in Sudan at this time, at the end of the 19th century, was that the reconquest of Sudan, Kitchener's reconquest of Sudan, dovetailed with the birth of cinema. So all of a sudden, the conquest or the reconquest of Sudan was looked at with extreme interest. There was a lot more interest than a lot of the other invasions, British invasions, British colonies, because they were seeing it in the making. So this was colonialism in the making, visualizing colonialism in the making. And I didn't realize how much Sudan was popular in Western popular culture, more so than just British popular culture, also in Hollywood as well. So my research is taking me a lot into why that was the case. This is Sudan was being narrated cinematically. The conquest of Sudan was being narrated cinematically. And with that comes drama, it comes all the elements of filmmaking, which is dramatic, which is romantic, which has all these elements of adventure and courage and all those tropes, cinematic tropes from the very beginning that you still see to this day. And this was a British colonial gaze that was very much further amplified in the Hollywood film industry. I have this.
Excuse me, Suzannah.
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think time is almost there.
Okay, great. So I will wrap up. There's a lot, as I said, 127 years of Sudanese filmmaking history cannot be recounted in 15 minutes. However, I will just read this one quote, and then I'll take you to my last slide, which I think is important. This is how Winston Churchill, who was a correspondent during the reconquest of Sudan, and he narrates in his memoirs cinematically how everything flickered like it was a cinematographic photograph. So there's a lot to be said about the history of Sudan and the violence of colonialism in Sudan. And I'm going to take you to my very last slide, because what I think is important right now is these young people now are in the Sundance Film Festival, premiering their film Khartoum, which is indirectly or directly, I haven't spoken to them yet about it, a rebuttal to the 1966 film Khartoum, in which Laurence Olivier appears in blackface. So we have a really good conversation happening now about how contemporary Sudanese filmmakers can address the history, the violent and racist history of colonial Sudan. Thank you, and sorry for taking too much time.
And thank you for everybody for inviting me to speak here. And I think this is such a great initiative that you're doing. And it reminds me of a film I used to show when I taught Arab cinema. And there was a Sudanese film that came out of a collective in the 1960s. And now you guys are kind of reminding me of it. But I'm blanking on the name. But I'm really happy to talk about this. I am a Palestinian and I am a filmmaker. Academically, there's people that have written academically about Palestine and its cinema more than me. So I'm going to be a little bit hybrid here. And I think I'm honored to be here because for the last year and a half, if I wasn't sad about Palestine, I was sad about Sudan. So I'm going to go through my slides and try to do an overview a little bit about, and a lot of what I'm saying applies to Sudan and all the other British colonial countries of the region. But I'm not, oh, I have to share my screen first. I haven't done Zoom in a while. Share, okay. And let me get to my screen. Okay. So I'm going to just go through a little bit. The reason I called it Palestine is not a checkpoint is that we've had so much cinema that's been about the occupation and the destruction of Palestine. And in showing that, they've denied it its heritage and its culture and a lot of the architecture that has been destroyed, you know, because this is a place that has thousands of years of architecture. Some of it is only archaeology now, of course, but even modern buildings have been destroyed continuously over the last 76 years. I just wanted to note that I had this project called Cinema Behind Walls when I looked at the cinema that comes out of places that don't have cinemas. So for the last 30 years, Palestine hasn't had any cinemas aside from one in Ramallah that I also think is now out of commission. But I wanted to show that it does have a long history of cinemas going back to the beginning of film, and particularly in the cities of Jaffa and Haifa and Gaza. Of course, none of these exist anymore. And these two, believe it or not, the ones on the right-hand side of my screen are from Gaza, and these actually, the one at the bottom actually survived till the first Intifada. And of course, there hasn't been a cinema in Gaza since the 1980s. And before there were cinemas, the way the Palestinians watched cinema was through these traveling cinemas, because the majority of Palestine, aside from the port cities, is a farm agricultural place. So they had mobile cinemas that would come to the villages. And the majority of films that were watched, of course, were Egyptian, followed by Hollywood and Bollywood. So there was a strong Bollywood influence in these traveling cinemas. And you can see this is heavily on architecture. I think a lot of this is interesting architecture, and it's a pity that they don't exist anymore. So with the disappearance of cinemas, weirdly enough, Palestine developed a bit of a film industry. And you do meet Palestinian filmmakers, young ones now, who have actually made films but never been to a cinema, because there are none on the West Bank, for example. So let's see, how do I do this? Okay, so I'm just going to give a short history of the cinema. And it's basically the cinema production starts in the 1970s with something called the Palestine Cinema Unit, which is out of the PLO. And it was very focused on documentaries. It was in collaboration with the third cinema movement happening all over the world, I guess what at the time was called third world countries. And it was very documentary based, and it was very based on the refugee situation, because of course they were also in Lebanon, the PLO at the time. And they made many, many films that couldn't show you the destruction as it, because they had no access to film it, because they were outside. But so that was heavily on the refugees and the memories that the refugees carried, whether it was the keys that have become kind of legendary now, or the clothing or the embroidery, what they carried with them in those camps. So that was the focus of it. In 1982, when the Israelis invaded Lebanon and destroyed all the camps, the archive of this unit disappeared, and it's a big mystery that everyone still tries to figure out. Did the Israelis completely destroy it, or is it hiding somewhere that some Israeli decided not to destroy it? But that it's always a mystery, and there's actually been a film made about what happened to this archive. And I just wanted to show you, these are painters, two Palestinian painters that also come of age in the 70s and 80s, and just to talk a little bit about the role of landscape, because like I said, it's a mostly agricultural peasant society, and you can see the role of women in the art. And the women are always dominant in the artwork, as is the land. So the Aqsa Mosque, of course, is in a lot of things, but it's predominantly the land. And the idea of it being both full of trees, but also full of the sea. And you don't see that in film happening at all. So I think that's an interesting, when we visualize the landscape and in the buildings and all of that, we don't see that in film as much. I might skip this slide, but I started to take a look in my work a little bit at the films that always were focusing on this idea of the occupation without recognizing the destruction of the architecture. And so there's two films, Five Broken Cameras, that's about 15 years old now, that looks at the destruction of a Palestinian village, and is told through the collaboration with an Israeli filmmaker. So it's a Palestinian from that village. There's another one now that's it was nominated for an Oscar. This is another one now this year. I don't know, No Other Land. I wrote No Other Country. It's called No Other Land. That's also been controversial. And I watched it last night in preparation for this. And there's nothing controversial about it. It's just another film showing the destruction of a Palestinian village. But because it actually shows the architecture disappearing live as he films it. And I think it's really important to note here why this film is getting international attention, and why Five Broken Cameras did. The fact that there's an Israeli funding, for one thing, and an Israeli partner on the film that appears in the film in both cases, it's palatable to the Western audience, and for better or worse. I mean, I'm not going to spend a lot of time belaboring that point, but where does the funding come from for these films? And again, it's mostly European funding, especially for the narrative films. So we have to think about, how does the funding determine what the filmmaker makes and what the final edit looks like? And this is a big issue throughout the countries that cannot fund their own films on their own. I wanted to show you that the poster for No Other Land, the one that's playing everywhere in the world, is this image on the left. But what the film shows, and which I think would have been a better picture, is this village that has now been destroyed. Had a very unique thing of cave dwelling homes. And so if it wasn't for this film, we would probably have no record of these homes, and also the watching them get destroyed. But it was a very unique form of architecture specific to this particular very small area of the West Bank. And there were several villages, most of which are gone now, that all relied on this type of architecture. So I just wanted to show that how important it is for film as a preservation of what is no more.
It's me, Alia.
Yeah.
You have like 2 minutes to wrap up, please.
Perfect, no problem. I think I covered this, and I wanted to show you again, this is an example of films that are very strong examples of just showing the destroyed architecture, but they were all made by non-Palestinians because the Palestinians didn't have access to these lands. So like, for example, Tantura is a Palestinian village that was destroyed in 1948. Only this house that you see standing here was left intact. There is a Palestinian filmmaker who's been trying for years to make a film about Tantura, and she's collected amazing material. Her film isn't done, but an Israeli released a film about it last year, and that's already made its tour in the film festival. So just to show you the challenges of capturing this for Palestinians. And then the last slide I'll show is this is at the bottom where you see all these settlements on the hill. This is from a film I shot in Palestine in 2018. It's called The Golden Harvest. And at the top is the same area, filmed by a Saudi British filmmaker in the 1970s. And so you can see that the land is no longer an agricultural land. And you can see maybe these trees in front of the settlements are pine trees that were imported from Europe to separate the settlements from the land, but also destroy the land. And because pine trees are not native to that region. And so I want to show you how film also captures this change of time in spaces. And we can see the landscape change and how the agriculture and architecture also changes with that. And I think I will leave it at that. I'm going to leave it at that for now. Thank you.
So, hello everyone. First of all, thank you so much for attending, and thank you, Modern Sudan Collective, for putting this event together. My name is Ahmad Salah, and my colleague Mirma Wareh. We are the co-founders of AMA Syria, or the Archive of Modern Architecture in Syria. And today we will be presenting Manifesting Modernity, Cinema Theaters and Urban Transformation in Damascus. The history of cinema in Damascus is deeply intertwined with the broader elements and spheres that shape the city, making it an integral and inseparable part of Syria's modern history. Throughout studying the history of cinema culture in Syria, this project, and to extend the entirety of our work at AMA Syria, aims to offer a new perspective to how Syrians perceive their own cultural heritage, challenging the preconceived notion that modernity in the region is merely a product of external interventions. And in this context, knowledge production becomes a powerful form of resistance against oppression and colonial centricism.
This project is an attempt to save the history of Syria's cinemas from erasure. The sensory experience of cinematic screenings was not unfamiliar to the people of Damascus, as they knew many modes of entertainment, such as al-hakawati, or the storyteller, and karakoz, or what is known in English as shadow play, where coffee houses were primary spaces for these activities. Al-Allaf, upon describing Damascus in the early 20th century, described shadow play as cinema baladi, or folk cinema. Globally, by the late 19th century, cinema as a technology started to develop as a means of entertainment. And later in the same year, the Lumiere brothers did their first screening of the cinematograph in Paris. They did another screening in the Ottoman Empire, and Ottomans were really amazed by this invention. Screenings started to happen in the region, in coffee houses and theaters such as Café Zawani in Alexandria, and cinematographs, or what were the preliminary version of a cinema, slowly started to open in Egypt, Tunisia, and Greater Syria, and Beirut and Jerusalem. Damascus was slowly starting to open to the world, with all the political reform and modernization happening in the country, and the city's urban fabric started to develop and expand beyond the walls of the old city, and a new city center was forming called Al-Majlis Square, or Place du Sarai, as it contained the main administrative building of the city. This square projected all notions of early modernity, new functions, new social classes, and new architecture. In this newly found city center, Damascus' first new cinema, its first ever screening in 1912 at the Theatre and Café of Zahr al-Dimashq, or what was also known as Théâtre de Damas, where the merchant, Habib Shammas, the theater's owner, decided to organize the screening. What we know from the screening is that the machine that was used operated by hand with light generated from a lamp powered by acetylene gas, and this description is identical to the cinematograph. However, it must be noted that this was not the first screening of Syria. It was told that the first screening happened in 1907 in Aleppo. In the final notes of Al-Allaf about theaters in Damascus, he says, and I quote, "The theaters disappeared and were replaced by tall, luxurious palaces, arranged according to the principles of Western theaters, where they watch fictional talking tales, talking cinema." While his statement was not entirely correct, as theaters did not disappear entirely, but this is an indication of the rising development of the entertainment culture in the city. The first official cinema to open in Damascus was not Zahr al-Dimashq. There were two cinemas said to have opened in the year 1916, Janat Qal'a and Al-Habra. Al-Habra was a family-owned cinema located in the old Christian quarter of Bakhtuma. Well, we don't know much details about Cinema Al-Habra, but Cinema Janat Qal'a was a political project of the Ottoman Empire. Starting from its name to its architecture to its location in Al-Salhiyeh quarter near the official Ottoman hospital. Unfortunately, there are no recorded pictures, but Rashid Jalal, who was a major part of the history of cinema, and he wrote so much about it, he mentions extravagant architecture, and I quote, "A huge amount of money was spent on constructing the cinema, which was decorated both inside and out as part of a campaign to divert people's attention towards entertainment and away from the growing political and nationalist movements that were gaining strength at the time, aimed at separating from the Ottoman Empire." The cinema was inaugurated by the commander of the 4th Army, Jamal Pasha the Great, later nicknamed Jabal Pasha the Butcher or Jamal Pasha Saffah by the Syrian people. The name of the venue was derived from a strait where the Ottoman Empire triumphed over the British fleet, and two German-made films were shown there, one of which was a newsreel depicting the German army's parade in Berlin. However, unfortunately, it did not last long as a fire destroyed it after 1 month of opening, and it was never reopened as the Ottomans were losing the war. Al-Shammas saw the opportunity and decided to add a cinema to Zahr al-Dimashq just a few months before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1918. Zahr al-Dimashq, which housed the first film screening, was originally both a coffee house and a theater, built in 1902. The theater was its true gem. Al-Allaf in early 20th century mentions it as one of the 3 major theaters of Damascus, and newspapers of the time stand witness to that, as it featured important plays and political events. And I may add that the creation of Zahr al-Dimashq was in of itself a stepping point in the development in Damascus. Urban, social, architectural, and political contexts all collided here to shape what it was. The architecture of Zahr al-Dimashq was formed and shaped by 16 years of additions following the changes of function. Prior to being a theater, it used to be an Ottoman police headquarters designed by the Ottoman Tanzimat or Ottoman reform style. Upon transforming into a theater and cafe, it featured a more extravagant and open style, until the eventual addition of the cinema, marked by the addition of a 3rd floor and a row of glass windows across its front facade, erasing all traces of the Tanzimat building. The opening day was over the top, a band playing outside the cinema entrance for an hour before screening, and then when the screening would start, it would move in to accompany the film. This performance was functionally equivalent to the architectural element of a billboard that didn't yet exist at the time, and so in that way, the screening itself would overflow towards the urban surrounding, and the cinema becomes part of the square. Cinemas started opening around Zahr al-Dimashq in Al-Marj Square. However, in June of 1928, a grand fire erupted in Cinema Nasr, located in the street north of Al-Marj, destroying the Sanjaqtar neighborhood, along with a large portion of Zahr al-Dimashq, which was the end of it. However, this fire was a turning point as it caused the French mandate to introduce the first laws governing the architecture of cinemas.
Under the French mandate, which commenced in 1920, cinema was starting to be organized and organized by legislations under 2 themes: censorship, with what fit the mandate's interest with certain groups of the society and construction. Parallel to that, the cinematic content started to evolve naturally along with the cinema theaters themselves. The cinema market flourished with American, French, and Egyptian movies, and importation of cinema with neighboring cities flourished, especially Beirut. The city expanded its center, and the cinemas followed. A new modern city center was formed, and it was a projection of the crystallized modern Damascene modernity. It included new commercial and administrative functions, entertainment hubs, and spaces that contained the public sphere, such as modern coffee houses, political party headquarters, nightclubs, and cinemas, with the client and passerby that were part of this new modern middle class. And in the midst of the cinemas were not just a component of that modern scene, but also a contributor to its formation at the same time. These spaces, typically lacking any female presence, started to integrate women, but this expression of modernity was not supported by a lot of religious circles of Damascus, and cinema theaters themselves became part of the public debate. Cinema Roxy, or later Cinema Al-Ahram, was one of the manifestations of this development in the city, as it opened in 1937 as part of the commercial building and was allegedly owned by the Lebanese investor Raymond Sabagh, owner of the land itself. This building, alongside the cinema, contained the Havana Cafe, where Al-Ba'ath Party was first established, and Al-Nadi Al-Arabi, another political party at the time, in the upper floor of it, and some commercial stores spread across the facade. This cinema engaged extensively with the public sphere, as its location in the middle of a road connecting the two urban centers of Damascus, the new one and the old one, coupled by crowds that would form in front of its entrance prior and after shows, provided the perfect setting to be mobilized as a demonstration crowd against the French. This building, unlike its predecessors, was designed and intended to house the cinema from the start, as it perfectly portrays an almost fully developed cinematic typology. This building design reflects clear artistic and aesthetic choices, not just as a reaction to the needs of the owner or of the function, but reflects the intervention of the architect, as the architecture was growing as a profession, and the architect was not just a mere builder, but a creator and a creative designer.
Upon independence from the French mandate, the cinema started to spread close to each other in the city center, and until 1960s there was almost 17 or 18. Cinema slowly reached its peak in the early 60s. Newspapers became witness to that growth. But what made cinema so successful was the feedback loop between the owner of the cinema and the audience, where the audience controls the market and the investor respects that need. Cinemas transcended their intended functions and acted not just as spaces to watch films, but as social hubs for families and the youth, and as spaces for practicing this newfound modernity. Even the urban space in front of the cinema, the hall, and the few minutes before and after the screening made the architectural space a container for the public sphere. Cinema developed its own architectural typology with a large, clearly marked entrance, the affiche or the billboard above it, the large entrance hall, and the commercial facades. And the architectural peak of cinema was achieved with opening the two last cinemas of the 50s, Cinema Zahra, which we see the facade on the screen, and Cinema Suhara. Unfortunately, after the coup of 1963 and the rise of Al-Ba'ath Party, socialist ideology governed the country, and it reached the cultural sector, which was institutionalized with the formation of the Ministry of Culture and the General Organization of Cinema. A cultural atmosphere of the elite started to form, and Cinema Al-Kindi, rented by the General Organization of Cinema in 1970, was a manifestation to that, containing and housing cinema clubs, cinema festivals, and cinematic screenings of local filmmakers. With the war and Al-Naksa of 1967, American, French, and Italian movies started to get banned one after the other. Al-Ba'ath Party decided eventually in 1969 to ban private importation of cinema and control the system alone. And with the system of owner audience was compromised and bottom up turned to up bottom. Television entered the market and homes of Syrian people. The middle class started to disappear with the shifting social dynamics of the country, and people started to enclose into their homes, and the public sphere slowly started to die out with the rise of authoritarianism and dictatorship. And with that isolation of cinema, the audience slowly started to disappear. Cinema owners secluded themselves to cinema production of fictional local movies in attempts to mimic the entertainment of American cinema, but this production was not enough to keep the wheel of cinema going. The city witnessed rapid urbanization. However, the government still passed laws organizing the architecture and urban components of the cinema buildings, but in reality, after 1960, only one cinema opened in Damascus. Cinema now. Cinema now, like the state of cinema theaters in Syria, remains unsolved and marginal within the government's reform agenda. Left to their owners, cinemas struggled to survive under restrictive regulations. By late 2024, Ahram Cinema in Damascus, or Roxy, was the sole operational venue which managed to circumvent the laws preventing the conversion of cinema license, and it was converted into a furniture market. Most other cinemas had closed, and those remaining were stigmatized to the associations with immoral activities. Cinema City, or what used to be Damascus Cinema, catered only to a wealthy minority by screening expensive imported films, excluding the average Syrian. Cinema Al-Kindi, the government-owned theater, screened only children's films or premieres of its directors, the directors of the government, and it also hosted lectures for the now suspended Cinema Arts Diploma program. But with this shortage of cinema spaces, alternative spaces started to form in the shape of cinema clubs in homes, cafes, galleries, and so on. And now, after the recent political events and the fall of the authoritarian regime, we can't wait to see what horizons this will open to us and to the cinemas of Syria.
This project serves as an, just to wrap up, this project serves as an introduction and foundation for a larger, more comprehensive initiative to archive, document, and narrate the history of cinemas in Syria. At AMU Syria, our work encompasses two main aspects: documenting knowledge through archival efforts and producing knowledge through research projects. This project was supported by Itijahat and conducted under the supervision of Dr. Nadi Abu Saadeh. It is part of our broader mission to explore the intersection of modern architecture with society, authority, legislations, and urban development, situating these within their wider regional context. Through our ongoing work, we continue researching, documenting, and sharing Syria's 20th century architectural and cultural experience and contributing to local discourse. Thank you so much.